5 study habits that are wasting your time. And at the end of this video, I'm going to cover the study habits that helped me graduate with the university medal. Number 1, multitasking. In university, I found there were 2 problems with multitasking, and the first one I was guilty of, in particular in my first semester, where I scheduled my time. So for example, 2 hours on biology and then 2 hours for this subject and then 2 hours for physics. And what happened was I would spend that 2 hours on that topic and then jump to another one. And it's so inefficient. When you first start university, things start relatively slow, or so it feels. So we start off with having a lot of required reading, very few assessments in the first couple of weeks. We're trying to keep up with the lecture notes and tutorials and practicals, depending on your discipline, maybe some clinics. And what happens is, if we try and jump around between those subjects, we're just wasting time, because we finally start to get into a flow in the material, and then all of a sudden, oh no, our calendar says now we're going to jump into something else, and we go into that subject. As the workload gets heavier in university, I've always found it really difficult, and the better way is instead to, for example, start one assessment and work all the way through it to the end, finish that, and then start the next one, as opposed to jumping around. In the same way, the last thing you want to be doing is working on an assessment that's due tomorrow, but your schedule says that you now should be doing the required reading for another subject, so you stop doing that and jump across to that. That's the last thing you ever want to do in university. Your assessments need to be done, and they need to be done on time and submitted so that you can get the marks. That's what we need, and that's what we want. And also, applying our knowledge and doing those assessments helps us learn at the same time, as opposed to something simple like required reading, which is just an extra component that we should do when we have time. The other side of this is when we have big assessments. So for example, a scientific report where we need to do planning or outlining, we need to do research, then we need to do writing, and then we need to do editing. Multitasking, trying to do all of those things at the same time, is not something I've ever found very helpful. I've always found it better to separate out the 4 main tasks of a big assessment. So the planning component, the research component, the writing component, and then the editing component. The 2 that mix the worst is writing and research. The last thing you want to be doing is sitting down and starting to write an introduction or a discussion to a scientific report, for example, and then stopping and researching and coming back and writing, and stopping and researching and coming back and writing. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of extra research as you're writing, because you realize something might have a light bulb moment. But in general, you want to have collated all of your research together, done all of that work so that you can sit down and then write relatively uninterrupted, so that you have better flow and you'll be able to complete that assessment faster. Number 2, study groups that just don't work. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of study groups that do actually work. I know I had one. But a lot of study groups don't work, and that's usually because they're more of a distraction than a help, and you'll have to be the judge of that. It's especially hard when we first start university, and especially if we have lots of friends from high school and we want to sit together and do our work together. But unfortunately, it's not always the best way forward. And often it's better to work by ourselves or separately or with a smaller group to get the work done, and not in a big group. If you have a big group assessment that you need to work on together, I've often found it also better to jump onto Google Docs and everybody can work separately, and you don't need to be talking about it all the time, which can just drag out the assessment longer and longer and longer. Obviously, you need to talk when you're doing the outlining component, but when you're researching and writing, you're better off jumping online together and doing it separately. That's what I found. Number 3, skipping class. This is one of the worst things ever you can do at university. Attending lectures, practicals, tutorials, clinics, every single face-to-face component is almost like a golden ticket to passing. When we go to these face-to-face components, and I understand we can't always do that, and it's great if we can watch them online, but when we go in person, one, we're hearing it firsthand from our lecturer or our tutors, whatever the material is. We then also have the opportunity to ask questions, which gives us, 1, the answers, but 2, it can also give the lecturer a chance to explain something in a different way or different language, which may help us understand that material. Also, the lecturer then sees that we're attending every single class, and that tells them that we care about our degree, that we want to do well, and that we want to understand the material. That puts us in a favourable light to the lecturer, which is actually important. They then look at your work when you submit it with that in the back of their mind when they're looking for marks to give you. They're also more likely to help you when you ask for help, because they know you've attended, that you've put in the effort yourself, so they're more likely to return that effort by helping you. So don't skip class. Number 4, not planning. And this goes from planning your entire degree right down to your individual assessments for a semester. I saw people add on an entire year to their degree because they didn't plan what subjects they needed to have completed by when. For example, some subjects in future years may need a prerequisite subject that you had to do in first year or second year, and if you haven't done them, then you can't do that third or fourth year level subject. So you have to plan out your entire degree before you start. Even if in your mind you might be thinking, oh, I might change degrees and I just want to see if I like this degree and so on, still plan your entire degree, then if you change, you change. But then you know you haven't wasted any time. And this filters all the way down to your assessments, where if you haven't planned all of your assessments and laid out the plan that you need week to week, you may miss an assessment, or you may submit one late, or one of your bigger assessments may have a smaller amount of work done on it because you forgot about it until it was it was closer to that time when it was submitted. So not planning your entire degree, your entire semester or trimester right down to your week can really muck up your study. It can really detract from your grades and make university a lot harder for you. Number 5 is passive studying, and that's where we do things like just reading the material over and over again, hoping that it will magically stick in our brains. Passive studying really doesn't work very well, and research shows us that active recall or active studying is far more successful. We're more likely to not only retain the material but actually understand it as well. Which brings me to the study habits that I used. So first of all, I always did active recall, even though back then I didn't know that that's what it was called. There are different ways that you can do this, and that's by drawing diagrams for yourself or by writing out the material. I actually used to do it speaking. I used to memorize my notes and say it out loud over and over again until I could say them out loud without ever looking at the notes. And that's the active recall component to it. And that's just what worked best for me. It was narrating or orating it out loud, but also doing diagrams is great, and flashcards or writing. The key here is that it's active, that we're actively using our brain over and over again, and the less that we need to look at our notes to check what the answer was, the better we'll understand and memorize it and know it for the exams. When it came to during semester mode, I found it best to work by myself most of the time so I wasn't distracted, but then I also had one key study group that really helped me. The reason this group worked so well for me is that we could sit together and not talk unless somebody had a question, and the best part was that we all felt comfortable asking a question and not feeling like we were going to be made fun of or made to feel stupid if we asked that question. That was a key component to our study group that made it successful. And then we would try and come up with the answer, and if we couldn't, we would all jump in on the computers and do research. So sure, it might have disrupted our work a little bit, but the point was we all then had a better understanding of a concept that we all needed to know. We studied in a group that was for the same subjects or discipline, not with people from other disciplines, because that wasn't helpful to our specific study. But one of the biggest things is that I went to every single class, every tutorial and every practical, and obviously every exam. But more than that, I stayed till the end. Often we can finish a practical, for example, in 1.5 or 2 hours, but the allotted time is 3 hours. I always found it best to stay the whole time and finish the assessment as much as possible during that time, or finish the work. This gave me the opportunity to ask my lecturer or tutor questions about the content, rather than me wasting my time later on at home when I'm trying to finish it off and submit it on time. I already had the answers, so rather than wasting my time, I was using the time that they had allotted for me and for all the other students to get that information from them. I can't tell you the amount of times I've asked a question and the tutor or lecturer gave me the answer, and simply by explaining it in a slightly different way to what they had done in the main class, that helped me understand that material. And that's what they're there for. They want to help us. That's why they're teaching. The other part was that I stayed the entire time, even in an exam. And that helped me a lot in my grades. So I could finish the exam early, but I would stay the whole time. And sometimes that was like for an hour. And I would just read over my answers and the questions again. And there were some times when I had a question and I thought I had the answer, and I have had a light bulb moment with, say, 15 minutes to go on the exam, realised I'd answered it wrong and written down the correct answer. Sometimes I just sit there and let my brain relax, because exams can be stressful. And sometimes we have a lot of information in the back of our mind, but it just doesn't want to come forward. I found by staying that entire exam time, it gave my brain a chance to relax and for that information to come forward. And the amount of times in the last, half an hour of the exam, after I'd finished ages ago, that another answer or a key point would come to me and I'd put it down, made a huge difference to my grades. It happened in almost every exam that I would remember something towards the end after I just sat there for a while and for it to come forward. I'll be the first to admit there were a couple of exams that I was frantic all the way through to the end and barely finished on time, don't get me wrong. But on the ones where I did finish early, I never left. I stayed until the end, and that had a huge impact on my grades. I know because I know from the amount of questions that I was able to answer correctly after I thought I had finished. And with that, the last study habit that I can share with you is single tasking. So the exact opposite to multitasking. Doing one assessment all the way through to completion, so it's ready to submit, and then starting my next one. And I always prioritize them. So each week I would have my smaller assessments that were due, like tutorials and practicals. I'd make sure each one was done in the order of when they were due, so the one that was due first was done first. And then each week I would have an assessment planner that told me what component I needed to do with my larger assessment pieces, for example, research or writing. Now, I made a separate video on how to do an assessment planner, so I'll pop the link in the description below for you. Happy studying.